Jung once told a room full of students in Zurich that every person carries a stranger inside them, someone they have spent their whole life trying not to become. Most people never meet that stranger. They spend decades building a personality that looks acceptable, feels safe, gets approved of, and they call that personality who I am. Jung had a different name for it. He called it the mask. And underneath the mask, he said, is everything you had to reject in order to wear it. That rejected material doesn't disappear. This is the part that unsettles people once they actually sit with it. Jung argued that everything you refuse to acknowledge in yourself doesn't evaporate. It goes underground. And from underground, it starts running the show. He called it the shadow. Not evil, not literally dark, just unlit. The traits, impulses, and desires you decided early in life were unacceptable, so you buried them, so deep that you forgot you ever had them at all. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Jung said, you can spot your own shadow by paying attention to the people who irritate you the most. Not mild annoyance, but the ones who trigger a disproportionate, almost visceral reaction. His theory was that intense reactions to other people are rarely about them. They're about a quality in yourself you've disowned, showing up in someone else's face where it's finally safe to hate it. This is the mechanism called projection, and it's one of the more genuinely testable pieces of Jung's theory. You dislike the coworker who's shamelessly ambitious, but somewhere you buried your own ambition as too much. And now it's easier to despise it in him than to admit it lives in you too. You're repelled by someone's neediness, but you learned as a child that needing things made you a burden, so now the sight of open need in someone else feels almost unbearable. Jung wasn't being poetic here. He was describing a defense mechanism, and it's one modern psychology has kept, even where it dropped his other ideas. The reason shadow work has exploded online right now isn't an accident, and it isn't really about Jung either. It's about a culture that spent a decade telling people to just think positive and is now quietly exhausted by it. Positivity culture told people to affirm, manifest, and vibrate higher, and papered over an enormous amount of unprocessed anger, grief, and shame in the process. Jung's shadow offers the opposite promise. You don't get well by lighting yourself up. You get well by going down into the basement first. But here's where Jung starts to depart from anything resembling gentle self-help, and where his reputation gets genuinely complicated. He didn't think integrating the shadow was a cozy process of self-acceptance affirmations. He thought it was closer to a confrontation, sometimes a violent one, with material you have every reason to want to keep buried. He wrote about people who glimpsed their own shadow and recoiled in real horror because what surfaced wasn't a misunderstood inner child. It was capacity for cruelty, for pettiness, for desires they'd spent a lifetime pretending they didn't have. This is the part the algorithm loves, and the part serious scholars argue about constantly. Popular content reduces Jung's shadow to the hidden part of you that's actually good, actually powerful, actually your true self held back by society. That's a comforting rewrite, and it's also not quite what Jung wrote. His actual position was messier. The shadow contains both gold and garbage, both suppressed strength and genuine darkness, and the work isn't to declare it secretly wonderful. The work is to look at it honestly, without either worshipping it or disowning it again. Jung's own biography adds another layer that makes people uneasy, and it's worth being honest about rather than skipping past. In the 1930s, as Nazi Germany rose, Jung made public statements distinguishing Aryan and Jewish psychology that read, at best, as catastrophically tone-deaf, and at worst, as something far more troubling. Statements he spent the rest of his life being pressed to explain. Historians still disagree about how much of this was genuine sympathy, professional ambition, or naivety about the moment he was living through. It doesn't erase what's useful in his psychology, but it's part of the full picture and content that only shows you the mystical, poetic Jung is quietly editing out the parts that complicate the myth. There's also the matter of how unfalsifiable a lot of his framework is. Concepts like the collective unconscious, the idea that humanity shares a deep reservoir of inherited symbols and instincts expressed through recurring archetypes like the mother, the hero, the trickster, are compelling as literature and nearly impossible to test as science. Modern psychology mostly kept Jung's clinical insights about defense mechanisms and personality, and mostly set aside the metaphysics. That split is exactly why he gets claimed by both camps, cited seriously in some therapy rooms, and treated as a mystic prophet in much of what goes viral about him. None of this means the shadow concept is empty. It means it's doing real work precisely because it names something people can feel but rarely have language for. That odd, disproportionate charge you get around certain people. That inexplicable defensiveness when someone names a trait you swore you didn't have. Jung gave that experience a name and a mechanism, decades before trigger became a word everyone used casually. That's a real contribution, whatever else is true about the man who made it. So what does actually integrating a shadow look like, practically, without the mysticism? It starts with noticing your own outsized reactions instead of immediately justifying them. When someone irritates you far more than the situation warrants, the useful question isn't, why are they like that? It's, what does this reaction know about me that I don't? It means sitting with an uncomfortable trait in yourself instead of externalizing it onto a convenient villain. It means noticing where you overcorrect. The person who's aggressively humble, aggressively nice, aggressively calm. Because overcorrection is often the shadow's fingerprint, visible in exactly the place someone is working hardest to prove it isn't there. It also means being honest that this process doesn't feel like liberation on day one. Jung was clear that meeting your own shadow is disorienting before it's clarifying. People who actually do this work often report a strange grief. Grief for the version of themselves they'd built. Grief for relationships that were only possible because a mask stayed on. That's not a flaw in the process. That's what it costs to stop performing a self you constructed for other people's comfort. What makes the online version of Jung so seductive is that it skips straight to the payoff. Unlock your shadow. Unlock your power. Without the part where you have to actually look at something you don't like about yourself and not immediately reframe it as secretly heroic. The real theory is slower and less flattering than that. It doesn't promise you're secretly a misunderstood genius under the mask. It promises you're a full contradictory person under the mask, and that meeting that person honestly is harder and more valuable than any 5-minute video can fully deliver. That's also why Jung remains genuinely contested more than 60 years after his death. Not because he was simply right or simply a fraud, but because his ideas sit right at the seam between real clinical insight and something closer to mythology, and different people, for different reasons, want to claim different halves of him. Reading him seriously means holding both halves at once, instead of picking whichever one makes for a better hook. If you want to actually understand where Jung's ideas hold up under modern psychology, and where they don't, that's worth its own separate look. Because the difference between shadow work as a real practice and shadow work as an aesthetic is bigger than most people realize.